First, I want to welcome everyone. My name is Jim Ramsey. I'm the chair of the Manchester and the Bennington County Democratic Committees, and thank you all for coming here for this important topic and discussion panel on climate change. Although we're sponsoring here, we thank the Manchester Community Library for this nice space. This is not a partisan issue. This is something that affects all of us, and we're here to learn more about what is happening locally here in Manchester, in the county, in the state, and globally. So with that, I will turn it over to the distinguished Joanne O'Connor, who is one of our Manchester Democratic Committee officers, and she is going to lead the panel, introduce and lead the panel today. So thank you.
Okay, thanks for coming, everyone. And I think you're all here because you realize climate is a crisis globally. And so before we get started with the panel, I just wanted to point out what the UN Climate Council has come up with in their latest report. It's not looking good. It's a situation where we may be so far along with the crisis with the climate and the gases that it could be uninhabitable at some point. So we have to do everything we can, and we have to all understand and learn what we can to help relieve the problem and bring our Earth back to a good standing. So you've all seen the bad weather we've had all over the country: floods, droughts, fires, tornadoes, the climate, the rising climate in the rising sea levels. The ice glaciers are just melting away. So I'm glad you're here today, and we're going to have a panel discussion of these folks who have done a lot of good work in their areas. So I'm going to start out by introductions. Here we have Kath James, who is our House of Representatives, representing Bennington County. She's on the Education Committee, very involved in all sorts of climate caucuses. So she's here to talk about what's going on at the State House. Next we have Mardi Crane. She's on the Arlington Energy Committee, and she's been doing a lot of good work with her committees in her town to get energy efficiency projects going in her town. So Mardi will talk about things going on in Arlington. And then we have Seth Bongartz. He's also a House representative from Bennington County, representing the districts of Arlington, Manchester, what are the other two? Sunderland and Sandgate, which Kath does too. So they represent those cities for us, towns. And next we have Jim Sullivan, who is the executive director of BCRC. We'll say Bennington. And Jim is involved in a lot of energy planning and energy reviews for all the towns in the community in the Bennington area. So Jim's going to kick it off and give us a little intro to what's going on around Vermont and all the different energy projects that he's involved in. So, Jim.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thank you all for coming out. I will assume that you guys are really interested in this topic because it is a really nice day out there, let me tell you. Whoa. So thanks for coming in here. So I've been at the BCRC, aka the Bennington County Regional Commission, for about 33 years now. It just that's a little disturbing, but I just realized when I was going over my notes that about half of that time now I've really devoted a lot of my project-based work on energy planning and climate resilience work, and I was like, wow, really? Yeah, but it was back in around 2006, 2007, I started working on a new regional energy plan, and I will say that a lot of my comments today are kind of going to be about energy stuff, and because that's really how we use energy, what kind of energy we use, is really driving a lot of the climate discussion. So it's about both, but energy and climate are really intertwined. So, but back when I started, I remembered writing in the plan that the Earth, the people of the Earth were using about 85 million barrels of oil a day, about 3.6 billion gallons. And we were writing at the time how that has to, you know, stabilize and drop off, right? I mean, it has to. We just can't keep doing that for a lot of reasons that I'll go into in a little bit of detail. So just check the numbers again recently. Now we're over 99 million barrels per day, or over 4 billion gallons a day. So, you know, and I used to use the image just to try to give a sense of what that was like. And I know some of you have heard this before, but I calculated the volume of the Bennington Battle Monument, right, and how long it would take to fill that with oil, given the rate that we're using it. And back in 2007, it would take between 5 and 6 minutes to fill the Bennington Battle Monument. And that's oil just pouring in constantly without ever stopping, right? And now we're obviously at the point where after 5 minutes, it's overflowing. So we use a phenomenal amount of oil, and that's just oil. I'm not talking about natural gas and coal, even the other fossil fuels. And you say, like, what is it? Why can't we stop this addiction that we have to oil and the other fossil fuels? And I mean, I guess that the answer to that is it's incredibly good at what it is doing and what it has done for us. It's an incredibly high density energy source. It's transportable, it's versatile, it's built all of the wealth and the prosperity that we have in the world today. But it comes with a lot of downsides, you know, obviously, that we all know about. And I think one of the really critical things that's often overlooked is that it's historically cheap. I mean, the energy we use is really cheap. And people look at me and say, Jim, haven't you been to the gas station? I'm like, well, no, actually, I haven't been to the gas station in like 7 years because I have an electric car. But I do go by and I do see how much it costs, and it's like $4 a gallon, right, for gas now. And they're like, well, yeah, that's bad. I was like, do you know how cheap $4 a gallon for what you get out of gas is? I always use the analogy, so if you're sitting here in Manchester with your car and you put a gallon of gas in and drive south, right, about the time you run out of gas, maybe with an average car, you get to about the Bennington-Pownell town line, right? Okay, so now your job is to turn that car around and get it back to Manchester. You can push it, or you can spend $4 for a gallon of gas to drive it back. I mean, that gives you an idea of the kind of work that gasoline and fossil fuels displace. So you can see why we love this stuff so much. Now yes, next comment. Oh, yeah. And other fascinating facts to talk about is, like, you know, we often talk about fossil fuels as non-renewable resources, right? But, you know, that kind of, like, that meaning of that kind of gets lost, non-renewable resources. I mean, that means there's a finite amount of this stuff out there. And we often lose track of that, right? And say, but are we going to run out of this stuff? I mean, people said we were going to run out of stuff. I mean, that's criticism I always get when I talk about this. People say, they said in the 1970s that, you know, that oil embargo with OPEC, we were going to run out of oil, we had to be careful. And I was like, well, you know, actually, I'll say the answer to that question is yes and no, right? We've used about 40% of the oil that's in that has been in the ground as of now, and so you say, well, there's a lot left then, right? Well, that's oil that's been, you know, put in the ground. That was put in the ground over some hundreds of millions of years, and we've used 40% of it in 150 years, and most of that in 50 years. And now, just, you know, citing some findings from, like, oil companies, right? They say there's about 50 to 55 years worth of economically extractable oil left. And some of us in this room are old enough to be able to think back 50 years ago and remember that that's not that long. so whether or not climate change is an issue for folks, we better be concerned about making a transition away from this stuff that's not going to be around forever. And the amount of natural gas that we have available is about the same. And people say, well, there's a lot more coal, which is, of course, the worst of the greenhouse gas producers, right, and polluters. There's like 120 years worth of coal reserves left. But guess how we get that, right? We use an awful lot of oil to get it and to move it to market. So without the oil, there's no more coal left either after 50 years. So we need to do something just for those reasons, if not for climate change. But clearly, we need to do something because of climate. As I say, that we have like two outcomes that we're looking at if we keep going the route we're going, at the rate that we're going. And one is that we're going to wind up spending so much of our economic resources and assets to get harder and harder oil and coal out of the ground because we've got the easy stuff. It's all harder and harder to get now and more expensive to get. So we're going to get to the point where if we don't invest in alternatives, we're going to basically cause a massive worldwide economic collapse. So that's one outcome. The other outcome, just as dire, no more dire, is that we'll continue to do that kind of investment in extracting and burning those fossil fuels until we cross a threshold that you alluded to, that we hit a positive feedback loop where the climate just gets worse and worse as the greenhouse gases build up more and more. The planet heats up, and that releases even more greenhouse gases from a whole bunch of sources, to the point where really the Earth becomes genuinely uninhabitable. I call that the Venus V2 scenario. That we basically create something where we can't live here anymore. So that's all depressing, right? But I like to be optimistic too. I do have to just throw in one other piece, because on that last point, I read one of our Bennington Banner columnists wrote a thing on the transition to renewable energy the other day, and his conclusion was that this is not the time to make this change. We can't afford to move to renewables now. It's just too complicated. It's too expensive. It's too burdensome. So now is not the time. That was the concluding statement. I would say, I agree with that completely. Now is not the time. 50 years ago was the time. We're right on the threshold of being too late right now, but we have to do something now. And we've managed to kick the can down the road to the point where we can't kick it down the road anymore. And quite frankly, now is not the time is about to become the Earth's epitaph if we're not careful. So what can we do? What can we do, right? And what are we doing? The other criticism I hear, along with the economic impacts and the now is not the time type of thing, is, well, Vermont is so small. In the global scale of things, our carbon footprint is so small that if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases completely, it would have no effect on the planet, right? And I would say there's always some truth to these statements, right? So Vermont does have, relative to the world, a very small carbon footprint. But I look at that as kind of just another example of the old tragedy of the commons. Again, those of us who are of a certain age remember that. But we looked at that at the Regional Commission, like at an individual level, like to make an analogy with the state of Vermont. And it's like every one of us, right, can do things in our home, like turn off lights, air dry our clothes, make minor adjustments in our lifestyle to do less energy. And some people in our households might say, that's not saving us very much money. That's not making a big difference in the scheme of things. So, I said, all right, I'll take that. So I looked at those incremental savings that all those individual behavioral changes could make at the individual household level, and I said, yep, you're right, very little impact. If every household in Vermont did that, big impact, megawatt hours of impact. If every household in the country did that, gigawatt hours of impact, huge impact, right? But if everybody uses the rationale that says, well, if we do it, it's not going to make a difference, then nobody does anything and nothing happens. So we kind of have to realize that we all have to be in on this, no matter how small. And no matter what we do in Vermont, it's going to be important for us to make those types of changes, just so that we can adapt and adjust to the future where the climate is changing, and the climate's going to continue to change. And we need to make adaptations to recognize that, and to be prepared for a future where we really need alternative energy sources to remain secure. So now more of my first positive thing I say. So the great thing is, guess what? We have the tools to fix this problem. We really do. It's not like we have to invent new technology and engineer new solutions. We have the things that we need. We just need to be able to do them. So, we need to do those types of things at the individual level, that I mentioned to save. We need building weatherization. We need more efficient vehicles, equipment, and appliances. We need to modify how we move about. And, I think I heard Seth say something about it. We need to address land use issues at a big scale. Like Vermont really is a good place to live, and it's going to become an even more attractive place to live as things change. And a lot of people are coming here, and we need to be able to accommodate an energy efficient, climate resilient settlement pattern, and that's more dense mixed-use development in and around our town centers and village centers, and we just don't have the infrastructure for that now. So we really need to invest in our infrastructure. We need to transform our energy systems, the types of fuels we use. For buildings, we need to move to advanced wood heat, electric heat pumps, transportation. In the short term, we need to move to electric vehicles. We need to just generally transition the way that we get around and start relying more on, inner city rail for larger distances. We have to think Europe, right, and how those folks get around over there. And a lot of these things, I would note, rely on a transition to electricity as a way of doing things. It's a way of delivering energy, basically, that can be done very efficiently if the electricity comes from renewable sources. And Vermont has been doing a really good job on the electric front about making that transition because of our renewable energy standard to get more and more of our electricity from renewable sources. But most of the energy modeling that I've seen suggests that even though overall energy that we need to use in Vermont needs to drop by about a third over the next 25 years to get us where we need to be, our use of electricity needs to go up by about 50% because that's a bit of a challenge, to be sure, but again, it's a challenge that we have the tools to address. And through renewable development, both renewable energy that we import into the state, as well as renewable energy that we generate within the state. And I think it's important to recognize the value of in-state renewable energy in addition to imported renewable energy. A lot of times people say, well, Vermont, small, we got to think Vermont scale, we can't really generate that much ourselves. I mean, there's a lot of advantages to controlling our own energy future and not relying on energy from distant sources that other folks are competing for. And there's a lot of uncertainty, and the transmission issues are complicated. And, one of the things I said, though, is like, any kind of energy development is going to have impacts, it's going to have negative impacts. It's going to be things people don't like or don't like to see, right? And that's compounded when it's under your nose in Vermont, right? So people's like, well, we can't have solar panels in those fields, and wind turbines are scary, and God forbid, hydroelectric dams, even existing dam sites. I mean, those all have really serious, significant environmental community impacts. I totally get that. But, sometimes in Vermont, it seems like we're a little bit self-righteous and say, well, we're doing such a great job and we're getting all this energy from renewables. So we get like over 30% of our electricity from Hydro-Quebec now, right? So Hydro-Quebec, and I have nothing against hydropower in general, concerned about the impacts on our rivers to be sure, but Hydro-Quebec in the very near future will have flooded forest land to the extent that the equivalent amount of cutting down every single tree in the state of Vermont, right? So we think, oh, well, we don't have to do energy development here because we're getting it from somewhere else. Well, you might not be able to see it, but those impacts are real and they're profound. So I suggest that we really should be thinking about developing as much of our own energy source as we can too. And other folks will probably talk about the economic benefits of the energy transition that we're looking at, because there are a lot of really good things that can happen about keeping our energy dollars in Vermont and investing in local businesses and local jobs and not exporting our money. We're to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars of benefit to the state. I do want to say, just if anybody's really interested in nerding out on some of the energy numbers, and climate numbers, I think the Energy Action Network's website is a really great resource. It's www.eanvt.org, and if you just click on their annual progress report, you get some really good pictures about their scorecard for how Vermont is doing and what we have to do going forward. And I've always found it very helpful. So.
Can you repeat that, please?
Oh, yeah, it's the Energy Action Network, and it's eanvt.org.
Thank you, Jim. That was very interesting. Jim, do you work in a coalition with these 17 towns, or do they all work independently?
Great question. So I think the Regional Planning Commission, so we have a regional plan, the Regional Energy Plan is part of that, and really all of the towns develop their own plans, which are all kind of guided by the regional plan. And so it's an idea of providing some consistent themes and directions, I think, and then we provide technical assistance, and we have a staff person who dedicates a fair chunk of her time to working with and helping support local energy committees. But really, when it comes down to it, it's really at the local level where things really happen.
Thanks, Jim.
I'm Mardi Crane Godrow, and I'm here in two different roles. One as an individual and one as a member of the Arlington Energy Committee. It's really important that I differentiate between these two roles. Essentially, excuse me, I want to tell you a little bit about the history of what we've done. Some of you've heard about the Arlington Plan. Essentially, Karen Lee, who's also here in the room, and I were getting, as individuals, frustrated about how slow progress was on the adoption of carbon emissions reductions in our area. And so back in the fall of 2021, Karen and I sat down and we wrote 3 ballot measures, which we wanted to get onto the town ballot for town meeting day earlier this spring. So what happened was that we wrote up the 3 ballot measures, and I'll tell you about each of them. And in order to get them onto the ballot, it required that we get signatures of 5% of the qualified voters from our town, that's Arlington, and that we managed to do, got them on the ballot. And as I say, there were 3 ballot measures. The first, basically, was to vote by ballot to see if the town of Arlington would reduce carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels used by the town through energy efficiency, carbon sequestration, adoption of renewable energy, subject to budgetary constraints in the Arlington Climate Mitigation Fund, with the goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2027. Now that's for the town, that's the municipality, town hall, the town vehicles and so on, not relating to the people who are residents in the town. The next was to create a sinking fund for money. And the third ballot measure was we asked Arlington voters to approve a $50,000 allocation of funding for that energy fund. The first two of these did pass, so Arlington voters have made a commitment to become carbon neutral by 2027, and we do have a sinking fund. However, there is no money currently in that sinking fund. But, you know, at least we have the most important thing. My understanding is that there were quite a number of people who were surprised that it was even on most people's radar. So this is a positive move. So now, moving over to the actions of the Arlington Energy Committee, which Karen and I both sit on, once these became approved measures, the work on helping to support our select board and to essentially do an analysis, an economic analysis, a use analysis, and so on, became part of the work of the Arlington Energy Committee. And that is a rather sophisticated set of work that we're working on. It's ongoing, and we intend to create a publication out of it. It will first go, of course, to the town, but my intention is this will also be published under a Creative Commons license, copyright license, so that it belongs to everyone on the planet. Anyone will be able to have this plan. We know of a couple of other towns in Vermont that have done something similar in the sense of trying to address becoming carbon neutral, and they've had to pay contractors to come in and do these analyses and advise them and so on. This shouldn't be necessary. You should have that template, that plan in your hands so that, it's a cookbook. And so that any town in the state or the rest of the country or the rest of the world could adapt the principles to being able to do the same thing. So that's where we are right now. We're in the middle of doing that analysis. And as I say, it's a fairly complex process, but we're having great fun with it. The Arlington Energy Committee meets once a month, and the...
Sorry, I just said it's great fun, it's barrel lax.
Okay, great fun, yes. In other words, we work late at night. A lot of hours. Our hair, we're both going gray in the process. Anyway, but if anyone's interested in the process, there's a couple things that I've done. One, I've written these out. I also have business cards here, so you can reach me. Karen's contact information is also on this, and we can make more copies of this for anyone who's interested in, getting a process like this going in their own communities or outside of here. It's the points that Jim made about, and Joanne have already made about the urgency of this. I'm a scientist. I'm a retired faculty member from Dartmouth. And I've been, sometimes it's hard to talk about climate. I've been following climate for decades. And people who tell you that we've got 10, 20, 30 years to work on this are full of beans. We don't. We're already hitting tipping points. The Arctic is leaking methane. This is horrific. There are things that we can do. We can all do the things that Jim was talking about in terms of our own usages, the choices that we make. Every light we turn off, every time we don't drive to the grocery store, we go once a week instead of, every day or whatever. I mean, I don't need to tell you. You know these things, or you wouldn't be here. But every one of you is a voice. We've got to work on this, and make sacrifices. It's okay to put your clothes on a drying rack instead of using the dryer. It's little stuff like that are going to make the difference. And to talk to our kids and our grandkids and let them know that there are ways that we can reach these goals. You can plant trees. If anybody's interested in a virtually free tree, get in touch with me. I bought 200 trees this year. I've potted them up, and I'd love to get enough to pay for the soil that I had to put in the pots, but the trees are there, and seriously, I've got white oaks and sugar maples that I'll make available to anyone who has a good home for them. So the only other thing that I want to mention quickly, because we're taking a lot of time here, is Jim mentioned the issue of resilience, and I imagine both Kathleen and Seth are going to speak to that as well. Right now, and this is another graphic that I've got here that people can take a copy of. We can get more copies made. Essentially, Vermont used to be a leader in the production or in installing solar. We are no longer a leader at all. In fact, there's one projection, which isn't on here, but that I've seen, where it's estimated that Vermont will become 49th in the United States in terms of new solar installations within the next few years because of the changes in the support for the solar industry in this state. And beyond that is the issue of control of future cost of electricity. Green Mountain Power gets their power from Hydro-Quebec and from Seabrook predominantly. There's some in-state sources. But the only power, meaning electricity, over which we're going to have control of the prices in the future is going to be power produced here in Vermont, not power coming from Canada or other out-of-state facilities. We must grow our our Vermont resources. So with that, I'll sign off and pass the sign.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm State Rep Kathleen James, and as you know, with Seth, we represent the communities of Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and part of Sunderland in the State House of Representatives. I've been looking around the room at all of the folks who are here today who took time to come out on a sunny spring afternoon to talk about climate policy. And I wanted to acknowledge the incredible difficulty of these conversations. As we've heard today, the climate crisis is escalating, and at one level it seems to exist out here in the ether, and at another level it impacts every single one of us. And when I think about climate, I think sometimes about what it might have been to be alive, say, at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, when the economy was shifting rapidly. This is disruptive. This is scary. It's exciting and poses opportunities, and it impacts all of our lives. So we're talking today about policies that impact the way we heat our homes, the way we get around. They impact our wallets and our pocketbooks. And these are difficult conversations to have. And in the State House, they're hard votes for many people to take. And we spend a tremendous amount of time up in Montpelier trying to think about opportunities and consequences. And these are the conversations, the very thoughtful conversations that often I think get lost in the shuffle. You know, by the time climate policy trickles down to the community level, folks are looking at sound bites and emails from advocate organizations, and what often gets lost in the conversation is how much thought and time we're trying to put into developing thoughtful, balanced policy that moves us forward while providing people with opportunities and minimizing any adverse consequences. And that's why I'm really grateful to all of you for showing up today, because these kinds of conversations are how we make informed policy. So, you know, looking around the room, I know that there are folks here who are probably really excited about all the work that we're doing. There are people who think that we're not doing enough, and there are people who think we've lost our minds and, you know, we're doing stuff that's going to hurt everybody. And so it's fantastic. So kudos to all of you for showing up. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the bills we're working on in the legislature this year, and Seth is going to do that as well. One of the bills that I think I'm feeling good about getting across the finish line is H510. It's a smaller bill. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but I think it's important. That is a bill that will provide grants and technical support to help municipalities take a look at their energy choices and transition to more renewable energy. So a town like Arlington or a town like Manchester could apply for a grant to take a look at how they can switch their municipal buildings off of fossil fuels to more renewable sources, which of course saves them money on heating, which then saves taxpayers money. So that's one of those bills that doesn't get talked about because it's not controversial and it doesn't drop into the furnace of public opinion. But it's an important bill, I think, H510. I think that'll get across the finish line this year. One bill that is, of course, guaranteed to pass is H736. The reason that has to pass is that it's the transportation budget for the state of Vermont for fiscal year FY23. So that's a must-pass bill. What's happened the past couple years is that we've introduced a bill that sets a framework for the T-bill. The T-bill is the budget bill. So last year, a bunch of us signed on to a bill called the Transportation Modernization Act. That bill didn't pass. It became almost like talking points for then how we set up all the investments in the T-bill, in the big budget. I hope this is making sense. This year's bill was called the Transportation Innovation Act. And again, a lot of the ideas from those bills wind up driving the investments in the budget. So a lot of times when you talk about how policy conversations kind of go off the rails, you know, some of these ideas that are buried in these 80-page bills that are filled with ideas never move forward, never make it into the T-bill, or become an idea that we're going to bring back the next year. So I feel like I spend a lot of time answering questions about ideas that aren't even really moving forward. But this year in the T-bill, H736, this is an $866 million bill. Okay, so this is the budget for paving, for all the transportation infrastructure that we invest in all over the state, but it's also where we put money for incentives. So you're going to see this year in the T-bill, we're still fighting over the exact amount. We had started out with $20 million for basically bicycle and pedestrian projects. So that's everything from helping people buy e-bikes to building more bike lanes to making our downtowns more walkable. Okay, so money for that. And the T-bill is also where you're going to see, again, don't know what the final number is going to be. On the House side, we had started out with $22 million in incentives that will help Vermonters either purchase EVs, or an overlooked component of this is we spend quite a bit of money helping people simply get into more fuel-efficient cars. So, you know, if you're driving a 20-year-old, pickup truck, and you want to get into a more fuel-efficient car, this will help you do that. And again, the idea here is that we create sort of a cyclical good where we help people get into more fuel-efficient cars, which then not only cuts down on carbon emissions, but helps them save money on gas. So that's the T-bill. Similarly, in the FY23 state budget, which is the $7 billion budget that powers everything we do in the state of Vermont, every government agency, every state-funded program, every state-funded grant, that's where you will see money for weatherization. So income-eligible Vermonters can get help weatherizing their homes, installing a heat pump, all of those sort of beneficial projects. So that all goes into the budget. We're working on a bill this year, which I think is really interesting. S148, it's the Environmental Justice Bill. I think it's going to pass. It came out of the Senate with strong support. It's going to be on the House floor this week. And this is an interesting policy bill that tries to ensure that negative environmental impacts don't fall disproportionately on different populations here in Vermont. So that takes a look. Ultimately, it's going to create an environmental map of Vermont, which I think is a really interesting approach. And it's going to try to look at communities where, due to race or due to geographic location, like rurality, or economic impact, like low-income areas, to make sure that those communities are not disproportionately impacted by contaminated water, by air pollution, by hazardous waste. So that's an interesting bill, S148. I do have some notes on that. The bill that's been getting talked a lot about this year is the Clean Heat Standard. That's H715. That bill passed the House and is over in the Senate now. And looking around the room, there are going to be people who think that the Senate weakened the bill and people who think that the Senate improved the bill. It is ever thus in the State House. The Clean Heat Standard is a really interesting piece of policy. The House Energy and Technology Committee spent months taking testimony from a wide variety of folks and then passed it over to the Senate, and they did the same. The Clean Heat Standard was one of the most foundational recommendations to come out of the Vermont Climate Plan. What the Clean Heat Standard would do is create a standard for companies that essentially sell fossil fuel in Vermont. So if you're the company that is the first importer of fossil fuel into the state, then you're going to be subject to the Clean Heat Standard. What it does is it sets up a planned and predictable transition for these companies to start increasing the amount of renewable energy work they do and decreasing the amount of revenues they get from fossil fuels. So it's sort of like a market-based incentive program. And it takes the amount of fossil fuel-based work that they did at this base year, which is going to be 2025, and then it requires them to reduce that by 4 to 5% a year. So they can start knowing what their business plan needs to look like. They're going to need to ratchet down 4 to 5% every year. And how they do that is by generating work that, or by accomplishing work that generates credits. So they can sell less fossil fuels, they can sell less carbon-intensive fossil fuels, or, I think the most exciting part of the bill, they can deliver clean heat solutions. So if you partner with a company to weatherize a home, your company would get credits from that. If you install a heat pump, you get credits for that. There are a lot of mechanisms built into the bill that are intended to make sure that this bill doesn't hurt the very people that it's intended to help. So there's a lot of very clear intent language that makes sure that a certain percentage of the credits need to be generated by delivering heat clean solutions to low-income Vermonters. There are life cycle emissions built in to make sure that any renewable energy solution you're delivering is not a renewable energy solution that has negative impacts. I know that conversation comes up around biofuels. So there's a life cycle emission requirement that will go into the generating of the credits. So, for example, if you're weatherizing a home, your company is going to be able to generate a lot of credits for that. If you're selling a biofuel that doesn't really has some life cycle emissions problems, it's either not going to be creditable at all, it won't count, or it's going to generate a low amount of credits. So this is a really complex piece of policy. The Senate strengthened the language that will require quite a bit of public input, extensive public rulemaking by the PUC, and a check back with the legislature, specifically to make sure that whatever we put into place isn't going to have unintended consequences. That was something the bill strengthened. I think that's important. So I'm sure folks will have questions about the clean heat standard. Those are the main bills I wanted to talk about today, so I'll hand it over to Seth, because Seth is going to talk about, this is sort of energy policy, right? This is work on energy policy. Seth and his committee, Natural Resources, is deeply involved in the land use portion of the equation and the resiliency, which is just as important as what I'm talking about. So,
thank you. I serve on the Natural Resources Committee in the House, and we have, I'm going to talk about 3 bills in particular as I go along here, but we have focused, this is something else we need to think about, along with, we talk a lot about carbon sequestration and carbon storage, and the issue Jim talked about, like can Vermont make any difference or not? Well, there are some very selfish reasons why it makes sense for Vermont to be deeply involved in the climate change work, and that has to do with biodiversity. That's the part we don't talk about as much, but the risk of Vermont losing its biodiversity is very real, and conversely, if we take the right steps, even within the context of us just being Vermont, we can make a big difference for maintaining biodiversity in the state of Vermont. And that is really just as important an issue as everything else we've talked about today. So one of the things that we spent some time on talking about early on in the committee, well, can we back up for a second? There's a wonderful piece of work done by the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department in conjunction with the Vermont Department of the parks, Forest and Parks, called the Vermont Conservation Design. And if you wrote down the address that Jim gave you, write down Vermont Conservation Design and go on the website and look at that, because it's a brilliant piece of work that really maps Vermont with a series of overlays and really identifies the parts of Vermont and the places that are the most important for maintaining biodiversity, the most important natural areas, the places that we have to be especially careful about protecting as we go forward. And this all does tie back, and I'll tie it back before I'm done, to the notion of climate change. But the goal of one of the goals of the Vermont Conservation Design is for Vermont to return 9% of its forests to old growth status. And old growth is where you really maintain biodiversity. And it takes a good 100 years for a forest to become old growth forest. You can argue about whether it's that or 150 or 200 years. But the goal is to at least have 9% of our forest be in old growth status, and in large part for the maintenance of biodiversity. And that has to be at different elevations, different parts of the state at different elevations, so that you really maintain true biodiversity. Because if you just were to do the top of the Green Mountains, there is less biodiversity there than there is as you go lower, but you also want to have some of that, so you want to have it be in places over the state of Vermont. So one of the things that my committee worked on, and I actually reported the bill out on the floor, was a bill, the current use program in Vermont. Let me just back up a little bit. Vermont is 75% forested. We may forget that as we drive around and we live in our communities. We may forget the fact that Vermont is actually very heavily forested. And part of the reason that we have that, that we maintain that, was an absolutely brilliant program thought through and put in place by the legislature 50 years ago, actually 40 years ago, 40 years ago, called the Current Use Program. And most of you probably know about the Current Use Program, but what it does is allow people to continue to own and therefore not develop forest land, because you get a very significant reduction in the tax rate if you manage it for the purpose of forestry. It has always been, and part of the theory there, by the way, is that by managing it for forestry, you're creating jobs because people are going in and taking out the logs, and it's been done. It's been a brilliant success because the foresters in Vermont and the county foresters and the forest and parks, the whole apparatus, has really ensured that as those plans are put together and implemented, that they're sensitive to the environmental. They don't just go in and, it's not a matter of just going in and clear cutting your 50 acres. It's done carefully. It's done in a connection with a forest management plan. And there are areas within this called ecologically significant treatment areas where if it's a wetland or a vernal pool or steep slopes where you don't have to take it off. So my point about this is it was brilliantly conceived and passed by the legislature a little bit more than 40 years ago, and it's been very well implemented. But one of the missing pieces is old growth, because what it does is require that active management all the time. And again, it's been done well. I want to be really careful. I don't have a single criticism of the Current Use Program. But what we did with the bill was allow, under certain circumstances, parcels that have 30% of those ecologically significant treatment areas, of really important ecological areas, to not have to be under active management. In fact, to allow them to return toward old growth. And that is, in terms of, by the way, old growth forests are, of course, your best sources of carbon sequestration and maybe more importantly, carbon storage. And they also are the places where we have the best chance of really maintaining the level of biodiversity that we have in Vermont. By the way, I'll just throw this out there. One of the things that I found stunning from a lot of the testimony we took is that we probably have 1 million species in Vermont we don't even know about. And that's kind of remarkable, and that does show, as we all know, all the reasons why biodiversity is so important. It relates to medicine, it relates to everything in our lives. And so that's one of the things that we're doing. And so that was one of the key recommendations, incidentally, from the Climate Council, was to do something along the lines of what we ended up doing with the bill that passed the House, and it is about to pass the Senate. And I believe we have the support of the administration on this, so I think it will actually get a signature. And I think it's a really important change to the Current Use Program and a really important step toward maintaining our biodiversity, and one of those key steps from the Climate Council for carbon sequestration and carbon storage. We have a bill coming up on, another bill before I get to that one. Out of my committee, we also sent a bill called 30 by 30. It's H606, 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. And this is the United Nations has reached the conclusion, the scientific community within the United Nations has reached the conclusion that in order to maintain life on Earth, we must have at least a minimum of 30% of our land in a natural state. Vermont currently has conserved about 24% of its land. That's pretty remarkable. That's been through the work of organizations like the Vermont Land Trust and others, and the state, and also the Current Use Program. So the goal is to get to 30% by 2030 and 50% by 2050. On the one hand, that sounds like a lot, or you're conserving 50% of Vermont. Well, if you think about the fact that Vermont is currently 75% forested, that actually means a lot less than we have now. But it's at least taking steps to ensure, along with riparian areas and all the other places, it's not just about forests, but it's kind of like the minimum that we need to get done in order to have Vermont still be Vermont first 30 and then 50 years from now. And that, of course, is directly connected to everything else that we're talking about here today. The third thing that we're doing, and this is one of the things, Jim touched on this some, is, and this is a bill I'm reporting out on Tuesday, to really, I won't go into a lot of detail about this because it's complicated, but it is to encourage, and by the way, the 30 by 30 and the 50 by 50 there's no sticks involved, it's all carrots. And it's all about voluntary people who want to be in this. In fact, there are more people now who want to get into have their land conserved than there's actually the ability to do by the land trust and other places right now. So there's a real public want to do this. And so this is helping, this will over time help set up the apparatus to help make that happen. The bill that I'm reporting on Tuesday is a housing bill in large parts. Both it's a combination of housing and Act 250. But the housing portion of it is to really incentivize, in a lot of ways, the building of homes in our town centers, in and very close to our town centers, and it's designed to help communities build walkable streets, and by that I mean, sidewalks and access to services without having to get into your car every time you do anything. It also improves money for $650,000, which actually isn't a lot, but as a form of, it's called bylaw modernization grants, to help communities take their bylaws in as they very often are, still stuck in the 1980s, when we had large lot requirements near the middle of town, which is really the opposite of what we should have, right? It makes much more sense to have dense, walkable, and housing in close proximity. And so it's to help towns bring their bylaws out of the 80s or 70s or 80s and bring them into this notion of walkable streets, access to services, and all of that, and really can help. Again, that's carbon emissions. It's also the lifestyle that most people, I won't say most, but a lot of people want. And if we can incentivize that in all the ways that are included in S234, and that, by the way, I'll take a little credit here with Kathleen. Kathleen and I held the housing conference in Arlington last fall, and out of that came the bill H511 that Kathleen and I sponsored. And the irony of this is that the bill H511 was actually taken up first in the Senate. And it came back to us verbatim, almost verbatim, in the parts in one bill and part in another, but it's basically the bill that I'm reporting out. A large part of the bill that I'm reporting out is the word for word the bill that Kathleen and I put in when the session started. So I guess the point of all this is that it's just as important for us to A, think about biodiversity, and B, think about land use and trying to have those patterns. Rather than have 1 acre zoning near the middle of town. In fact, the bill does require, if you want to be in these programs, that you have a minimum of 4 units per acre close to town. And it makes some of the programs, and which helps encourage especially affordable housing, but actually housing in general, close to towns, available to some towns to which it hasn't been available in the past. So it's a really important bill. It's going to have some controversy, and I think I'm going to be on the floor for a long time on Tuesday with it, but I'll just leave it at that, and just say that it's important to think about biodiversity and land use at the same time we're thinking about things like the clean heat standard.
So thank you all. Each of you, if you could just say a few words about what obstacles you might see in the work that you're doing.
Sure, and maybe we can keep these quick so that I'm sure folks want to ask some questions. I guess, the biggest obstacle that I see to making progress is the one I mentioned before, which is that climate policy occurs in a highly politicized arena, which is really unfortunate. And we are trying to develop policy and make votes that impact people's daily lives. How they're fueling their cars up, how they're heating their homes. These are bread and butter, pocketbook issues. And so it's very, very important that we create thoughtful policy, and that can be sometimes harder to communicate in the environment in which climate conversations happen today in our communities. So I guess I would call that the biggest challenge.
I'm going to agree largely with what Kathleen's just said. Communications are really important. There's a great author, Catherine Hayhoe, has written, I think it's called Saving Us. She basically points to what Jim did today, which was to frame the conversation in a way that is approachable by almost anyone. It takes into account the needs of people who might otherwise be polarized. And it's something that all of us, when we're communicating with people, not jump into a polarized position, but rather really think about the other person's frame and be good communicators and compassionate to their needs. Ultimately, it's probably the only way that we're going to get everybody on board.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to add too much to that equation. I guess one of the things that happens to us is, we'll walk out of here today, and then we get up tomorrow morning and everything's the same, and the next day it's the same, and so it's really hard to see climate change happening day to day. But I think the fact that young people get this to the soles of their feet, and actually in a way that's kind of scary, because it's I read a story the other day about how the degree of anxiety it's causing in young people, it's constant with them because they see it and they see what's happening, and they really want us to take action. But I think we can be, even though there are some things in Vermont, like the way the PUC is dealing with solar panels and net metering now. There's some things that aren't going in the way that they should. I think the fact that Vermont passed the Global Warming Solutions Act 2 years ago during Kathleen's first term before I got there is a milestone, and I think that now the legislature showing the I'll say courage, but the putting together the next steps and making that happen is encouraging. But by the way, to my first point, Vermont, even though Vermont's 75% forested, we're losing 15,000 acres a year. You don't see that happening. And I didn't know it until I sat in my committee and started listening to the testimony. And so doing the kinds of things that we're doing really are important. But the changes are the negative changes are so small, one day at a time or 1 week at a time, compared to you don't notice them and you don't think about it. And so it's really understanding these cumulative impacts and acting on it that's really the challenge. But anyway, I think I remain, I guess it's part of my nature, but I remain always optimistic.
Thanks, Seth. And a good counterpoint, because as my wife will tell you, I'm eternally pessimistic. So, but I mean, I think that the key thing is what everybody said so far is really true. I mean, there is an urgency that we have to act. We have to act immediately. We have to act dramatically, and that is associated with significant disruption in people's lives. And I think that we have to get to the point where we recognize that there's going to be disruption. I mean, we have to accept that. We have to do everything we can to minimize the impact, the harm, the damage to people who can, at least afford the disruption. But we have to recognize that our lives have to change. The way we do things have to change. They have to change, and they have to change soon. And so just that recognition that, we can't just keep going down this road and pretending it's going to get better at some time in the future. It has to start getting better right now. And I mean, one of the things that we can do right away, from a state perspective, is stop authorizing investment in any additional public funds in fossil fuel infrastructure. Drives me absolutely nuts when I see a bunch of public money going into a new state building or something that. Or some building that requires a lot of taxpayer money, that's an investment in, say, an oil-based heating system that is got a 30 or 40-year lifespan. That's just, aside from the fact that it's irresponsible, it's stupid. So, anyway, I will leave it at that. Thanks.
Can I just make one of the points that we were making when we were trying to get the ballot measures in Arlington passed was economic. Essentially, Arlington had spent $20,000 on heating fuel in 2020, but that was when fuel only cost $2.25 a gallon. Think about that. It's going to cost more for 1 year's fuel than if we had gotten that $50,000 into the fund so that we could have put in heat pumps. Electricity is not going up that fast.
So, yeah, I'll hand it back to Joanne. I think we should go to some questions from the audience.
Yeah, let's do that. But before we do, I just want to end on a couple of positive notes about what's going on in Vermont. Over 6,500 Vermonters have purchased electric vehicles, so that's good. So we need to get more to do that, but that's a good thing. And 63% of our total electricity is renewable, so that's good. So we just have to keep at it and get the word out that we need to do more to make our climate better. You have a question? We'll open it up for questions. Okay.
My name is Eric. I just have one question. I looked through all the reports, the climate change report that was done in December, and while there are some benchmarks in that report that you're trying to achieve, there's nothing that describes where you're going to get that electric energy from. So is there a plan in the Vermont state to develop energy sources that we could look at? Because right now I can't figure out where you're going to get all that additional energy you're going to need to power the heat pumps and the new electric vehicles that you're going to allegedly want to put on the roads.
So yeah, I'm a planner. So we have a plan for that. Yeah. So a few years ago, all of the regional planning commissions in the state developed new regional energy plans, and part of those plans, they had to include strategies for developing renewable energy resources within the regions, and they had targets for each region. So every region, including Bennington County, so we had a target of like 70 megawatts of new renewable energy from our region, and we identified locations where that could happen. We identified constraints for that development and how it should happen. Now that's being revisited now, especially at the state level. In fact, I've got a meeting with the Public Service Department, I think on Wednesday or Thursday this week, where we're talking about new generation targets. But again, the projection when we developed those regional energy plans 5 or 6 years ago and carried forward is that about 50% of our future electricity growth would be imported from outside the state, from renewable sources outside the state, because it's a huge amount of electricity, and it would be tough to do it all in state. And so 50% of it would be developed in state. Again, that may be adjusted. In fact, I think the state might want us to be looking at a little bit more imported electricity, and I'm thinking about that. But you know, there's the state. At one point, we had a pretty clear breakdown of solar versus hydro, and a relatively small amount of solar and wind and a relatively small amount of new hydro because of the unlikely prospects for building new dams and rivers in Vermont, just using existing dams. But it was a significant majority of the new electricity would come from solar. And again, we identified locations, both built locations on buildings and brownfields and parking lots and things like that, as well as how much we would need to do in so-called greenfield development for solar. But solar in and of itself can't do it. It can't solve the problem. Solar, at night, there's storage, sure, but in the winter, you can't really store it that long. So solar is a hugely important piece of it, but we've got to look at other sources too, and we did in those regional plans.
Hi, my name is Daria, and the gentleman came and spoke last week about there was talk in the legislature of outright banning gas-powered cars by 2035. Can you speak to that?
That's not true.
The question is that there was talk from somebody that the state would outright ban electric cars by 2030. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I'm thinking electric. Gas cars. So everything would be electric by 2035. And I don't know anything about that. And as far as I know, it's not true. But I would say, on the other hand, is all the momentum's going that way. By 2035, it's going to be damn expensive to drive a gas-powered car around. So, they might not be banned, but we ought to be doing everything we can to make that transition now, because whether or not they're banned, it's going to be extremely difficult and expensive for people to use them. So.
And I guess this just underscores what I talked about earlier, the difficulty of advancing thoughtful climate policy in an atmosphere that often spawns misinformation. There's zero talk in the legislature about banning gas cars. What we look to are incentives. So we want to design thoughtful policies that help people who are interested in buying EVs or getting into more fuel-efficient cars do that. And that's also what the Clean Heat Standard is about. There's nothing in the Clean Heat Standard that requires Vermont consumers to do anything. So nobody is required under the Clean Heat Standard to change the way they heat their homes. It's an incentive to make more affordable, more renewable options, more widely available, with a very strong focus on folks who are lower income. So what you want to look for is thoughtful incentives.
Anybody else? Question?
Hi, I was wondering how you feel about geothermal and pellet furnaces as a heating source.
Up for grabs?
Geothermal is, to the extent that it works, the technology is somewhat complicated, but to the extent that it works and it relies, therefore, on electricity to use it, that's a good source. And so I think geothermal is a good source of energy. What was the other one you asked for? Pellets. Oh, pellets. Pellets and furnaces. And this will come out a little bit more, they do pollute still, because it's a fuel and there's particulate out of the air, but they're probably a much better source, especially with the technology with the second burns in the highly efficient furnaces. They're probably a much better source of energy than burning fossil fuel. And they also, by the way, and this relates to the notion of savings for Vermonters, that can come from all in-state. And we have to do it in a way that is consistent with good forest management. But that's jobs in Vermont. It's not sending, I've seen various estimates, but one estimate is that we're spending in Vermont, or effectively sending out of Vermont, $1 billion a year on fossil fuels. Jim told me once, a couple of years ago, I think this number is right, that Bennington County alone is sending out $100 million a year. That's nuts. And so as we think about how to transition to better fuel sources, and mostly electricity in Vermont, anything we can do to have it all be generated here just keeps all that money in Vermont. It's sort of self-evident that makes sense to the extent we can, but it's very important that as we look at pellets and other sources of wood fuel, that we do it in a way that is sustainable. But the good part about the current use program is, in most of our forests, but 70% of our forests, by the way, are in the current use program. They have to be well managed. So it is a good source.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add a quick note on your question about geothermal. So geothermal is basically, it's a heat pump technology. So we hear a lot about heat pumps, and most of what we hear about heat pumps is so-called cold climate heat pumps. They're air source heat pumps that are really becoming more and more efficient and a reasonable way for space heating. Geothermal is the same technology, but it pulls the heat from the ground instead of air. It's more efficient than air source heat pumps. It's just more expensive to do, especially for retrofits. So it's a proven technology. It's a great technology. It may be good for new construction. And actually, Bennington County, of all the regions in the state, has the best substrate for geothermal, but it's pretty expensive except for new construction. But air source heat pumps, same technology, but using heat from the air, super efficient and definitely a big part of our future.
Hi, my name's Walt Klinger. I'm retired from 20 years banging up and down the high iron on the Vermonter, the Montrealer, Ethan Allen. I just want to call your attention to the fact that a dozen years ago, a study was done between New York and Vermont to look at passenger rail down here. We were promised we would get some service down here by 2020. Well, it's 2022, and the state's still dinking around with what's happening on the north end to Burlington. It's about time we told the state legislature they need to put up the money to link the communities together down here, use the right-of-way that they own, which is the Vermont Railway, which the state owns that track and that right-of-way, and put in light rail. We could have light rail service that would link Arlington and Shaftesbury and all the communities between Bennington and Manchester. We could have trolleys running back and forth all day long and into the evening down here for a relatively reasonable sum. And we need to get on the state to give us some alternatives for transportation. In the meantime, the state of Massachusetts is looking at the Pan Am line, which recently got sold to CSXT, of putting in passenger rail from Boston to Rensselaer. If we had a train station in Pownell, it'd be 3.5 hours to Boston and 4.5 to New York. Manchester community ought to support that project and get to be a participant in that study while it's going on.
No, nothing.
Walt is one of my bosses, so I take my cues from him.
Okay, one more question.
Thanks. My name is Karen Lee, and I work on the Arlington Energy Committee, but I'm speaking on behalf of myself because we've talked a lot about reducing carbon emissions and fossil fuel, and I love sequestering carbon in old-growth forests. I'm a major, major fan of biodiversity. That was my first activism, was in environmental protection. But we're going to continue to drive diesel trucks for a long time. And if we promote EVs, which we are doing, and that's good, it's very, very, very slow. All these fixes are good, and we in the room we're preaching to the choir. But everybody outside the room, most people outside the room, are just mad because gas costs so much. Which, of course, I'm the one over here. I wish it was $10 a gallon. But what we really need to have a discussion about is grabbing carbon that's in the air and storing it in the ground. And all of the talk we've had today is not about that, except for about the old-growth forest. We need to have some serious conversation about how to improve our health of our soils. In our agriculture, our treatment of our golf courses, our homes, everything that we do every time we put Roundup on the ground, we're killing the mycorrhizae that save our planet. We need to have more conversation about incentivizing farmers to do no-till agriculture, to get the toxins off of our land so that the photosynthesis, the natural occurring carbon-grabbing photosynthesis, can put it in the ground. We've had no conversation about that today. I was in the solar business. I'll talk about renewable energy all day long. That's not going to save us. It needs to be a part of our future, for sure, no doubt about it. But what we need to do is act today to make our health of our soils so that we can stick the carbon in the ground. It's crazy when I go to Walmart, not Walmart, Home Depot, whatever big box store, you see an entire pallet of Roundup. What the hell? We are killing ourselves while we're talking about saving ourselves. Sorry.
Kath's got an answer for you.
Yeah, I wanted to respond really quickly, and then I just wanted to offer, we've gone way over. There are two more questions. I really don't want to leave unanswered questions. I know the DuPonts have had their hands up, and I see somebody in the back. So,
I'm sorry.
yeah, just want to say super quickly on that, totally agree. We need to look at every solution. We can't leave any solution behind. And I just want to respond. I know you meant it off the cuff. I do not wish gas were $10 a gallon, because we have got to design solutions that do not leave anyone behind. And if we cannot do that thoughtfully, and if we cannot think about the impacts of our policies on people who cannot afford to fill their tanks, to pay for their heating oil, to weatherize their homes, to buy an EV, then we are failing in our climate policy. And that is really, really important. We have got to move forward with all of us. So, and I know you didn't mean that seriously, but it struck a chord with me because it matters. So if we could take these last couple questions.
I just want to quickly, on the topic that Karen brought up about storing carbon in the soil. Most people don't understand about a technology that essentially where rock dust that is derived from the element or from the rocks that are called basalt, when they're ground up and put into the soil, they sequester carbon. And it's possible to literally, in a field, sequester hundreds of tons of carbon that we're not doing right now. It's a long conversation. We could have a whole meeting on that topic, but there's stuff out there that's happening.
And who over here? Okay.
Okay, this is Kathleen, a good lead into this question. No stone left unturned. You know, if electricity was a few cents a kilowatt hour, all this electrification would more or less happen naturally. And so my question is, are you guys considering putting a new technology, nuclear plant where Vermont Yankee used to be?
I'm not aware of any plans to do that. I'm sorry, that's a very short answer. I don't know if Jim would know better.
I'll take a swing at that, sure.
Can you repeat the question, please?
The question is, where Vermont Yankee was over in Vernon, are there any proposals to put new technology, nuclear plant there, hopefully to provide lower cost electricity given the level of electrification that we're looking at? And I mean, I would have to say this, it's like, aside from the well-documented concerns about nuclear waste and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's a reason, frankly, that Vermont Yankee shut down, and there's a reason that other nuclear plants really aren't being actively built in this country, is that it's not cheaper right now. You know, renewable energy is cheaper than nuclear energy right now. Nuclear plants are incredibly expensive to build. Now, I'm not saying if they make a breakthrough at the folks who are doing the tokamak fusion reactors, and we have sustainable, controllable fusion reactions, I'm all on board with that for sure. But right now, the technology isn't there.
I'll just add to this is that Kathleen and I had lunch a week ago or so with Tim Briglin, who is the chair of the Energy and Technology Committee in the House, and listening to him talk about some of these issues and about where the power is really going to come from. He says that it's going to come from offshore wind, to the extent that we do everything we can in Vermont to generate as much as we can here for all the reasons that makes sense for us. But the technology for offshore wind is getting so good that is very likely to be where and it's also much quicker to get it in place, because even though I'm intrigued by regen plants, by the way, I'm intrigued by the newer technology, but it's not going to happen in Vermont, because even if we wanted it, it would take 20 or 30 years. Even if at this point, because of the fact that it's not that popular, and also just the expense, and right at our fingertips, and it makes all the sense in the world to go with renewables at every step we possibly can. And offshore wind is really figuring to be a major part of where we end up getting our total source of needed electricity from. Although we have to do everything we can in Vermont to take care of it ourselves. And then the part that has to come from out of state, I think we're going to see offshore wind being a larger and larger component, and that much more, and very quickly.
We're getting to the point where we're going to want to wrap it up in a minute, so if we have a quick question.
Technological fixes won't solve social problems. I like Kathleen's statement about incentives and a number of approaches and moderation and the necessity for social justice. What are you going to do for people like myself who have electromagnetic sensitivity and can't bear to be in an EV? Why is it that 40 years ago I had a car that always got 45 miles to the gallon? I never could get it to 50, but I got it to 49.5. I went to the Dorset electric vehicle exhibit, whatever. These are not Volkswagens. These are not transportation for your everyday person. You are going to leave a lot of people behind. When I talk about social configuration, I would say keep locality. Think several times about closing the general store and closing the school. I've never lived in a place where I have to go 50 miles to a co-op. All right, we talk about healthy food and growing it locally. So these are some ideas. And the last thing I'd say is there are certain things to do as far as insulating houses and so on, types of dwellings, but they leave out a lot of other things. Has there ever been a competition for small affordable dwellings? And then I would say, this is a technological fix, but has anybody put on the list, if you need a new roof, have it be a light-colored reflective one? And it will cut down, in the summertime, what you need by 5 to 10 degrees. Sorry, I'm longer.
Lots of good creative ideas. Thank you for those. I can just keep it quick and say that we need every creative idea on the table. When you talk about EVs, I have one. I love it. Happy to talk to you afterwards about why I do think it's a great car. But, right. the electromagnetic sensitivity. I can't really respond to that cue right now, but I can say that one of the ideas that's contained in this year's T-bill is, rural microtransit. So what's rural microtransit? So that's basically Uber for communities like ours. So we need to start thinking creatively, about how we can help folks get around in a way that is, innovative and is looking toward the future. And we need to, as I said, get every idea on the table. So I think. Yep.
So let's wrap it up here, and we have some coffee and cookies in the back, and we can have some conversations with the panelists if you'd like some more questions answered. And thank you to all of you for coming today. It was a great time. We got a lot of information. Thank you for coming. So thank you all. Okay, take care.